We first began exploring the crisis in cosmology in 2021. Since then, it has only gotten worse. The word crisis, as we use it here, does not refer to crisis in the traditional sense, such as a natural disaster, war, or physical danger. I am referring to crisis in the Kuhnian sense, meaning a stage at which a leading scientific paradigm breaks down, due to the accumulation of anomalies and contradictions that the prevailing model cannot adequately address, as well as an unwillingness to question the existing model and/or explore alternatives. Now, since I began the series, I have received numerous messages from individuals in other fields, such as archaeology, geology, biology, virology, and even history, telling me that the same thing is happening in their field as well. This suggests that model breakdown is presently widespread and is happening beyond cosmology and beyond the hard sciences. While it is not possible to explore each of these crises individually in the scope of one video, it is possible to conjecture about a possible underlying cause for all of the crises. Arguably, it has to do with the nature of predominant paradigms. Thomas Kuhn's work revealed that once a paradigm becomes deeply entrenched and institutionalized, it becomes dogmatic, hegemonic, and unyielding to falsification and change. However, his work does not deeply explore why this happens. In today's show, we will begin to explore the why and the how. Drawing on my background in critical discourse analysis, I posit that a predominant paradigm, meaning an institutionalized paradigm that is officially entrenched and accepted, functions as a form of power, insofar as it operates as a dominant discourse. In order to flesh out what this means, let's define our terms. Generally speaking, discourse refers to the communication of ideas. As a noun, discourse is defined as any form of written or spoken communication or debate. And as a verb, discourse means to speak or write authoritatively about a topic. There are 4 traditional modes of discourse. They are narration, description, exposition, and argument. To define these briefly, narration is storytelling. At its simplest, description tells us what things are like according to the 5 senses. It is a form of describing what is observed. Exposition is the kind of writing and speaking that are used to inform. The final mode of discourse is argument. The purpose of argument is to convince through logic. Argument is typically expressed as a theory or hypothesis and involves persuasion. Now, while there are several definitions of paradigm, the most common is, quote, a framework containing the basic assumptions, ways of thinking, and methodology that are commonly accepted by members of a scientific community or field, end quote. By this definition, a paradigm will necessarily contain each of the aforementioned modes of discourse. In this way, a paradigm can be understood as a type of discourse. Indeed, the word paradigm and discourse are often used interchangeably. And a predominant or entrenched paradigm, therefore, can be understood as an official or dominant discourse. As the name suggests, dominant discourse is the language and actions that appear most prevalently within a given society on a given topic. It is the official and officially recognized narration, description, explanation, and communication of a particular idea or topic. Dominant discourse entails the ultimate emergence of one discourse as dominant among other competing discourses, and this requires power. In critical discourse analysis, we know that dominant discourses, or dominant paradigms, reflect the beliefs and ideas of those who have the most power in society. This is partly because the meaning-making apparatuses are traditionally in the hands of the powerful. Simply put, those with the most power are able to define the narrative. And once this narrative becomes deeply ingrained and institutionalized, it is taken for granted as true or obvious. According to CDA, a problem with dominant discourse is that it can become so ingrained within a society that few people challenge it. Without these challenges, quote, few new ideas enter the mainstream. The society thus may stagnate and fail to progress, end quote. Because it has the power to define the parameters and move the goalposts, a dominant discourse or paradigm narrows and limits the response to the discourse and furthers the uncritical participation by individuals within it. While a dominant discourse may be broad in scope, such as in the case of a broad scientific paradigm, for instance, it narrows and/or reduces the public's options for dealing and interacting with it. In addition, quote, even when people want to challenge the dominant paradigm, they may fail to do so if they lack the power to get their message far enough into the public eye, end quote. Now, it cannot be overstated that the power to widely disseminate ideas, especially new ideas, is linked to money and funding. This is especially true in the field of cosmology. As plasma physicist Eric Lerner points out in an open letter on cosmology published in the New Scientist on May 24, 2004, the development and dissemination of alternative cosmological theories and models has, quote, been severely hampered by a complete lack of funding. Indeed, such questions and alternatives cannot even be freely discussed and examined. An open exchange of ideas is lacking in most mainstream conferences, end quote. Lerner goes on to lament that, quote, virtually all financial and experimental resources in cosmology are devoted to Big Bang studies, end quote. In addition, all peer review committees that control funding are, quote, dominated by supporters of the Big Bang. As a result, the dominance of the Big Bang within the field has become self-sustaining, irrespective of the scientific validity of the theory, end quote. The American theoretical physicist and philosopher Sean Carroll published a response to Lerner's letter only 1 week later, on May 29, 2004. In his response, he brazenly maintains that funding alternative research is a waste of time, since the Big Bang theory is so well established. Carroll states that, quote, at what point does a scientific theory become so well established that it's no longer worth listening to alternatives? There's no easy answer. Scientific theories are never proven correct. They simply gather increasing evidence in their favor until consideration of alternatives becomes a waste of time, end quote. And when exploring whether or not the scientific community should devote a fraction of funding to consider alternatives to the Big Bang, Carroll responds with an emphatic no, stating that funds are finite and, quote, we have to use them the best we can, end quote. He maintains that the chances that the basics of the Big Bang model are wrong are, quote, so infinitesimally small that it's just not worth the bother, end quote. Now, given the growing inconsistencies with the Hubble constant and the contradictory observations that are coming back every day from the James Webb Telescope, Carroll may have been forced to temper his stance somewhat if you were writing this today. Returning to Carroll's letter, in response to Lerner's point about the lack of alternative ideas allowed at major conferences, Carroll boldly admits that, quote, yes, young people who disbelieve in the Big Bang are unlikely to get invited to speak at major conferences, or get permanent jobs at research universities, end quote. Carroll's response to Lerner is a perfect example of dogma and gatekeeping in science, and sounds more like something one would expect a politician to say. In order to be truly empirical, and to honor the principles of falsifiability and open debate, which, if we recall from the previous show, are supposed to be the driving principles of science, a scientific community should, as a general rule, allocate a percentage of funding to exploring alternatives to the prevailing model, and or testing the veracity of that model. This is why Carroll's comments, and the candid nature with which they are delivered, are so shocking. How can a scientist claim that we have come to the end of the road with respect to our quest for empirical knowledge and answers about the universe? This is akin to proclaiming the end of ideas and the end of scientific pursuit. Interestingly, Carroll's claims about the exceptionalism and superiority of the Big Bang mirrors claims by politicians and political theorists about politics and governance. For instance, in the book The End of History and the Last Man, American political scientist Francis Fukuyama argues that liberal democracy has proven to be a fundamentally better system than any of the alternatives. As such, liberal democracy represents, quote-unquote, the end of history. In other words, liberal democracy is the best and final political paradigm, and thus there can be no alternatives ever. Talk about circular arrogance and self-interest. How can anyone that calls themselves a political scientist declare that history ends with their particular model of government? The irony of the claim that Western liberal democracy is the best and final form of government for all countries everywhere is evident in the reality that many Western liberal democracies are presently in a state of utter chaos and societal collapse or decline. For instance, the United States, with its exemplary and enviable Constitution, has been in decline for decades and is currently plagued by the chaos and confusion of government-sanctioned identity politics and relativism run amok. In addition, the U.S. has one of the highest poverty, unemployment, incarceration, mental health, and addiction rates in the Western world. These are all signs of a culture in deep crisis. And let us not even begin to mention the role of the mainstream media in all of this. As is the case with standard cosmology, rather than address crisis and breakdown, those presently in power in the United States tend to double down on a broken and failing model. Whether we are talking about the crisis in cosmology or the crisis in Western culture, reluctance to question a broken model or system reflects the dogmatic, hegemonic, and unyielding nature of institutionalized ideas and predominant paradigms, including within the institution of science. As the American economist Thomas Sowell once noted, quote, "Some things must be done on faith, but the most dangerous kind of faith is that which masquerades as science," end quote. Sowell has also observed that oftentimes what makes an idea or theory correct is the fact that people's careers depend on it not being wrong. And he has stated that, quote, "It takes considerable knowledge just to realize the extent of your own ignorance," end quote. One can also argue that it takes considerable wisdom. The philosopher Socrates was once told by the oracle at Delphi that he was the wisest person in all of Athens, to which he replied something along the lines of, "Nobody knows anything, and I know that I know nothing. Thus, if I am wiser than others, it is only because I recognize my own ignorance." This statement by Socrates can more or less be interpreted as the wisest person is the one that knows that they know nothing. It is similar to a Chinese proverb that translates to, quote, "The wise man knows he knows nothing. The fool thinks he knows all," end quote. Now, we can probably assume that Socrates did indeed know that he knew many things and was very wise. But the implication or lesson of his statement is that we should never stop learning and never stop seeking. That just when we think we know, there is so much more to discover. Another way to say this is that we don't know what we don't know. And this is why we must never stop seeking, especially for those that claim to be scientists. So how do we go from the humble wisdom of ancient philosophy to the dogmatic arrogance of present-day science and social science? The answer is very complex and cannot be explored in one show. But much of the problem lies in industrialization and the related specialization of knowledge and science. Since industrialization, science and scientific peer review funding has become increasingly specialized and linked to capitalist enterprise and big business. This growing government-science-business alliance demands and forces specialization and acquiescence to particular dominant ideologies and interests. For instance, the unquestionable greenhouse theory of atmospheric change currently directs everything from city planning to corporate investment. Some examples are the city planning initiatives known as Green Cities and, more recently, 15-minute cities. These are official initiatives that aim to make municipal developers and businesses conform to particular social environmental interests. Now, when policy demands consensus in science and dictates what type of science is acceptable, and when institutionalized science is happy to oblige, then we are no longer dealing with objective science. This suggests that there is a growing relationship between institutionalized science and institutionalized power. If scientific change was merely about gradually shifting scientific perspectives that come about due to model falsification, as Austrian-born philosopher Karl Popper and others have claimed, then why was Galileo imprisoned for life for his new perspectives on cosmology? And why was Italian philosopher and cosmologist Giordano Bruno burned at the stake for his? Both of these men promoted alternatives that challenged the cosmological narratives of the Catholic Church, which was the dominant power structure at the time. It should be noted that many believe that Bruno was executed for his views on religion and not cosmology, but it stands to reason that his oppositional cosmology did not help his case. Now, while predominant paradigms and power structures no longer burn opponents at the stake or sentence them to house arrest for life, they do still demonize and mock opponents and critics. For instance, in his response to Eric Lerner's critique of Big Bang cosmology and the lack of funding for alternative theories and models, Sean Carroll goes as far as to call Lerner dumb and, quote, "a crackpot who claims that the Big Bang has no empirical successes," end quote. It should be noted that in addition to Lerner, the Open Letter on Cosmology was signed by 33 scientists, the first among them being Halton Arp. Halton Arp was an American astronomer and critic of the Big Bang. Along with other observational astrophysicists, Arp maintained that redshift observations of galaxies and quasars contradict the Big Bang theory's hypothesis that redshifts are caused by universal cosmological expansion. This is one of the hallmarks of the crisis in standard cosmology. Many of its assumptions and suppositions are contradicted by observational data. Now, are we to believe that a credentialed and highly regarded astronomer and observational astrophysicist, such as Halton Arp, is dumb or a crackpot? Of course not. What Arp and others are actually being condemned for is daring to criticize and oppose the predominant cosmological paradigm. When a scientific paradigm and its gatekeepers appear far more interested in self-preservation and forced consensus than empirical observation and debate, then we are no longer talking about science and are firmly in the domain of predominant power. However, despite the present state of science and cosmology in particular, there is reason to hope. If we recall from previous shows, in the paradigm shift cycle, crisis is followed by model revolution and eventually paradigm change. While it may take decades or even centuries for the change to happen, once a prevailing model is at the crisis stage, revolution and paradigm shift are inevitable. Indeed, it is the crisis that triggers the eventual revolution. In this respect, one can argue that the crisis in cosmology is actually an opportunity. As one viewer pointed out in a comment to the previous show, the Chinese word for crisis is a combination of the words crisis and opportunity. According to ancient Chinese philosophy, opportunities often arise from crisis. With respect to science, this suggests that crisis, or model breakdown, is also an opportunity for innovation and breakthrough. The current cosmological model has given us 100 years of darkness. Dark matter, dark energy, black holes. These still unproven concepts have done little to help us understand the nature of the universe. While theories like general relativity have helped to usher in an acceptance and celebration of paradox and absurdity, both within cosmology and in the broader culture. The standard model ultimately views the universe as dark, random, disconnected, and incomprehensible. As such, it offers little hope or meaning. So how might a different cosmological model impact society? The answer to this question depends on the nature of the new model and its worldview. One alternative that presently exists, and which has a radically different perspective than the present standard model of cosmology, is the electric universe model of cosmology. The EU model posits that electricity is the driving force in the cosmos, and also that countless electromagnetic fields connect all things in the universe, at all scales, in a complex dynamic structure. This notion of an integral connectivity is especially interesting and thought-provoking. The idea of a force that permeates all things, from the most infinitesimal to the most massive or galactic, and connects all things, is one that should pique our interest, not least because it hints at a far more cohesive universe than we are led to believe exists. This has both practical and philosophical implications. It is impossible to know which model might one day replace the standard model. But one thing we can say for certain is that we have not reached the end of history with respect to cosmology and our understanding of the universe. Far from it. Like Socrates in the ancients, it may be wise to concede that there's still so much that we do not know, and so much to discover. It is an interesting and exciting time to be alive.